Since 1999, Dubuque has experienced a significant number of flood events. This flooding has led to 6 presidential disaster declarations and an estimated $70 million in damages to public and private property in the downtown and North End neighborhoods. In response, the City of Dubuque has implemented the B Branch Watershed Flood Mitigation Project. This multi-phase project consists of several infrastructure improvements that, when combined, will mitigate flooding, improve water quality, and enhance the quality of life within the B Branch watershed. I'm Kristen Hill, Communications Specialist for the B Branch Project, and I'm joined today by members of our city's engineering department, Darren Meering and John Dienst. First, Darren will tell us about the highlights of 2017, including the completion of the B Branch Creek Greenway. Then, John will tell us about 2 B Branch related storm sewer improvement projects that are scheduled to begin in 2018. Welcome, Darren.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here today. So, after 2 years of construction, the city celebrated the opening of the B Branch Creek Greenway in July of 2017, and restoring the creek has been referred to as the most impactful phase of the overall flood mitigation project. Tell us, why is the Greenway such a critical component?
Well, it's by far the most expensive piece, so that's one of the rationales for that statement. But it's also a lot of the other improvements just aren't realized. The benefits of the other improvements aren't realized without this improvement, and just the magnitude and the size of the improvement. So the upstream retention basins, while they do, provide some of that benefit, the full benefit isn't realized. We'll still have flooding if we don't have this creek project. And the other part is it just provides a place for all of this water to go. Before that it was in streets, it was in people's basements, and now we have a safe place for that water to fill up and slowly move through this part of our community.
So it's a connected system. You talked about the detention basins. How are they connected to the B Branch Creek Greenway, and how does that system work exactly?
Right, so the flood mitigation project, you attack the issue in multiple ways, and one is the detention that I mentioned. So, that's miles away from the creek that we're talking about here, the B Branch Creek, but all that water finds its way down to this creek eventually, and so those upstream detention basins will hold that water back so that it's all not being combined and getting to one place, so that it has to pond and gets to certain depths that impact people. So it allows the downstream area to drain, get that water out of the system before this water then can flow down and join in. So that's how the detention basins work. And then we're also doing the pervious pavement systems, the green alleys, where we're trying to reduce the volume of water that actually will run down to the creek area. So that will soak up the water. And the reason why, again, the B Branch Creek is so important, because water does get down there, and it will get down there, even though we make it less, and even though we might delay some of it, it still all has to all comes down here and has to have a place to get out of the area.
It's still the path of the water.
Right.
Okay. So several rounds of thunderstorms moved through the area the week before the B Branch Creek Greenway ribbon cutting in July, as well as even that evening. So tell us, how did the system fare during those heavy rains?
Well, it functioned just like it was designed, and just like we kind of programmed it to, where people saw that the water will kind of come out of what we think of as the creek, the limestone lined area that people can walk along. What most people think of a creek, but during a rainstorm, the water will slowly rise out of those and kind of go over the banks into what we consider the floodplain area, which occurs along most creeks naturally. And so we recreated that area, and that's where that stormwater ponded. And then after the rainstorm goes away in a few hours, then it all drains down. So it provided a place for all that water to go that previously had, like I said, flooded streets and basements. And we still have street issues, and John's going to talk about addressing that. But even so, this alleviates that to some degree, because even the storm sewers that are there today can operate better, without having that obstruction downstream. There's a free flow of water through the area.
Now you mentioned how the water rises above those limestone blocks along the channel and kind of fills up into the grassy area, or
Right.
kind of that floodplain. So about how long does it take for that water to go down typically after like a heavy rainstorm?
Well, today it takes a matter of maybe 6 to 10 hours to drain it if it fills up to its highest level. One of the things we have right now is that we have some improvements we need to do downstream that we'll probably talk about. But like today, as we're sitting here, the water will pond up a certain depth before it actually start flowing out to the lower section of the creek that we built previously. And so then it gets up to a certain area, and then we'll make sure as the rain, completes, then all the runoff flows through. Then we have to kind of draw it down even below those culverts using pumps right now, just to get down to that normal low level.
Okay. Speaking of the floodplain area, so there is a lot of different amenities along the Bee Branch Creek Greenway. Can you tell us a little bit about those and why the city decided to incorporate those into this project?
Well, the primary reason why there are other things than just flood control elements associated with this project is a direct result of just engaging the public. And when we were moving into the design of this project, we asked them, just citizens, yes, it's flood control, but like in a day like today where it's not raining, what other use would you like for this area of the city? And so that's kind of how those items evolved. It was asking questions, do you want a hike bike path near here? Do you, what other types of, community amenities would you like to see incorporated? And we weren't promising that we could do it, but we certainly wanted to have their input so that if there was an opportunity and we could do it and it fit with the system, then we could make it a reality. And in many cases we were. So some of those things I mentioned, the hike bike path, that goes through the area. So the Heritage Trail, just because of where the flood-prone area was and where our project is, it matched up well with that, meaning that hike bike path that extends through the city's north end all the way to Dyersville comes right into our project limits. So for a certain part, we had to kind of move and relocate part of that path, but the idea is, well, as long as we're here, let's extend it down to Garfield Avenue and make it a little longer and kind of incorporate into this public space. And then just with having the hike bike trail, what are some amenities that you would have with the hike bike trail, like a kiosk that would provide directions, or community events that someone who's coming into the area might be interested in, or the other thing is the having an amphitheater right off of the hike bike trail as a not only just as an alternative place to kind of rest after being on the trail for a while, but it's also right next to Audubon Elementary and providing an outdoor space where they can use it almost as an outdoor classroom where they can talk about a creek and the issues along with habitat and fish or aquatic organisms or water quality, all those things. Students could get out there and really touch and feel and experience that. So that was another amenity that we added, and we've already had some performances there that are pretty neat. Just having singers or dancers or what have you, just and available for the public, for neighborhood groups, or just a family reunion, whatever. People can use that space that they couldn't before. As far as amenities, there's also a little a slide area, just taking advantage of the embankment. So the slides are kind of right along, not very high off the ground, but because of the slope of the floodplain area, that you get that effect. Then we also incorporated a kind of a community orchard area and a public play space. And anytime we develop a park-like area, we always, as a city, try to consider what are other, things that are in the area, so they don't duplicate those things. And so with Audubon School right across the creek, and having your more typical classical playground equipment, by the orchard, we have some kind of like buried logs that kids can tumble on or jump on and what have you, just things like that next to the orchard. So that's the majority, and then just seating areas and viewing vistas, and you know, some fountains that serve multiple purposes, not only aerating the creek, but you know, providing that ambiance with the flowing water and the, you know, the. I think you know, the main, you know, as civil engineers, we're tasked with solving and addressing this issue. And the reason we want to solve and address this issue is because it's making the area unlivable for a large swath of our community. And so certainly anything we do, we can't solve one problem and then create other problems or make it so that the area is unlivable for other reasons. And so that's a large part of why we have to, you know, pay attention to other things other than just solving a flooding problem, and why some of these amenities are important, not just for the neighborhood, but just for the community, so that, you know, we take full advantage of the project.
Yeah, it seems as though when I've been to the Greenway that the slides is a really popular spot for families, and they're fun. I've been down there with my kids before. And then also the amphitheater, I've talked to teachers at Audubon School who were just excited to be able to go out when the weather is nice and even just use it as a time to go read a book to their class, or just work on their regular schoolwork, even if it wasn't related to the creek. So it seems like it's going to be a great resource for people who live in that area. All right, so there are two segments of the Bee Branch Creek. There's the downstream and the upstream portions, which you kind of referred to earlier, and they're separated by the railway yard. So how does water currently drain, and you kind of talked about this already, from the upper to the lower, and then what is the city's plans for improving that system? You kind of talked about how we have to pump the water now, but moving forward, will that change?
Yeah, so right now that there are two existing culverts that pass underneath the railroad tracks that allow the water to flow from what we call the upper reach, or the upper section north of Garfield Avenue, to the lower section that would flow down towards 16th Street. The issue is that what we built upstream of Garfield is actually lower than these culverts. So we don't have to pump all stormwater. I mean, the flood waters, when they move through, will flow by gravity out of the system, but only so much of it can flow by gravity. Then we've got to kind of drain out the bottom of the upper Bee Branch area. So that's where the pumps come in.
Okay.
And you're right, these culverts have been placed for decades. They're actually originally built by the railroad, and they were kind of incorporated into what we call the Bee Branch storm sewer, which the city built on either side of these culverts. But now that we're upsizing and directing more flow to these culverts, you know, the time is at hand where we have to kind of increase the size of these culverts. And so we've been working with the railroad for a while on trying to figure out what's the best way to build these culverts without impacting, you know, what they do on a daily basis. You know, railroad property is unique for many reasons, but you know, if we were to just simply come through and dig up their property and take their tracks out of commission here in Dubuque for, you know, 6 months to build new culverts, you're not impacting just, you know, a few acres of property. You're impacting hundreds and hundreds of miles of tracks throughout the Midwest that would now have to be rerouted. So that's why this process and working with them to make this a reality, you know, takes longer than just any other typical culvert project. But we're planning to move forward with that project. We just sent correspondence off to them regarding, you know, agreements and the plans and specifications on how we would do that. Clearly, they have a vested interest in making sure nothing bad happens under the railroad tracks. So that's part of that process. And what we're planning to do right now is what they call micro tunneling, which is kind of like a drilling rig where they just you know, kind of drill underneath the railroad tracks. You don't disturb anything on the surface, and you install the culverts that way. So again, that way it allows the railroad to operate like they normally do while these culverts are being installed. And we're looking to, you know, initiate the bidding on that later in 2018. Construction, you know, depending on the contractor's approach might mobilize late in 2018 and just start setting things up. But the likely scenario is that an early 2019 contractor to be on site and raring to go and start installing those culverts.
Okay. And so you had said earlier, it takes, I think you said maybe 6 to 8 hours or so for the creek, the upper Bee Branch Creek, to drain. Will putting these larger culverts in underneath the railroad tracks shorten that time frame?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I mean, the answer
So
you're
depends.
expecting. So the lower Bee Branch, or down by 16th Street right now, is hydraulically connected to the Mississippi River. So the water level in that area of the creek will move up and down just depending on whatever the river stage is. And that's how that section was designed with that in mind. The upper part, where we have a lot more green infrastructure, plantings, what have you, in that section, we didn't want the creek to be dependent upon the river stage, because if the river comes up, it could come up and flood certain areas and be up like that for several weeks and then kill all the vegetation, and it's not a very sustainable condition. So we actually have a control structure between kind of near the railroad tracks to prevent that from happening. Which it means is if the river is up, then we will have to close this gate and then manually still kind of pump down the bottom part of the upper Bee Branch, but it won't be we won't be doing that as often as we have to today without those culverts. So right now the maintenance and the operation of the upper Bee Branch is more than it definitely will be when we get those other culverts in place. And the other culverts clearly are going to drop down the peak flooding elevation that we would expect. I think right now, one storm we were looking at that happened in 2016, the ponding depth could have been about 6 feet lower in the upper Bee Branch had we had the culverts through the railroad property in place. So they do make a significant difference just in the peak elevation that the water will actually get to in the upper Bee Branch.
Yeah, so you likely won't see the water get as high once those culverts are in, probably in 2019, like you said.
Right. Yep.
Okay. So you talked about the hike-bike trail, and that hike-bike trail is connected to the Heritage Trail, and of course goes along the upper portion of the Bee Branch Creek Greenway, and then it's along the lower Bee Branch and 16th Street Detention Basin as well. So how are those two trails going to connect?
We're still trying to figure that out.
Oh, okay. So multiple options on the table?
Originally, way back when, we were looking at doing a bridge to carry the railroad tracks over the creek, where now we're going to be doing the tunnels, as I mentioned. So tunnels, boring tunnels under a round culvert under the tracks wouldn't really work very well as a hike-bike path. So we were looking at having an on-ground kind of workaround down Garfield and Pine Street over to Elm and back over to 16th Street. But now we've been kind of discussing the idea with the railroad about repurposing the existing culverts that go under their tracks and using them for both stormwater conveyance, so they'd still function during these heavy rainstorms to allow more stormwater to pass under the railroad tracks. But on most days, they could serve as a way for bikers and hikers to get under the railroad tracks and actually connect the two trail systems.
So just like a dry tunnel with probably like a concrete bike hike path through it where people could go through?
Right, yep.
Wow. Okay, very neat. Well, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
So this past summer, there were floating islands installed in the lower portion of the creek in the detention basin. Can you tell us about what floating islands are and why the city chose to do that project?
So the floating islands, they can also be thought of like a floating wetland, but what they serve multiple purposes, and that's really the reason we did it, was for multiple reasons. It wasn't just any one reason. So one of the reasons is they help with the habitat of the creek. So this is a creek we're recreating it, and so we're trying to incorporate as many natural type features as we can to try to promote fish habitat and anything that goes with that, just to have that for our community. And so these will help promote fish habitat. They do that in a couple ways. One is just for places where fish can go underneath and seek comfort from the sun, or kind of moderate the temperature of the creek itself. The other way is just the plants themselves create habitat for animals either below the surface or on top of the surface. And so that's incorporated in these floating islands. So water quality, they also help with reduction of nutrients such as like phosphorus and nitrogen that that we use on our lawns as fertilizer to stimulate the growth of grass. The problem is that when excess amounts of that runs off into a creek, it can promote the growth of algae and other types of things in a creek, and then when that stuff lives its life and dies, then it can use up the oxygen and it can create some ugly, nasty conditions in a creek, or typically more a pond, but also in a creek. And this will help reduce those nutrients, keep it out of the Mississippi. It'll help all the way down the Mississippi, keep the nutrients out of the Gulf of Mexico, where you have this area where there's no oxygen because of the conditions I've described, where the dying, the process of the plants dying actually uses up the oxygen, and so there's none left for fish, and then you have these fish kills and dead zones. And
sure.
So, and like the last reason is just for the aesthetics. And we had, like many of the elements that we have in our project, they wouldn't have happened if we wouldn't have had outside support. There was a cost to the city, but that was offset to a large part by outside funding assistance. And so the Vision Iowa River Enhancement Community Attraction and Tourism Grant was a program that helped projects in Iowa to help draw tourism and attractions to Iowa. And the River Enhancement, RECAD, as it's referred, is more like a river, so that's kind of fit with our project. And just to really provide a unique feature to draw people to eastern Iowa, and that was part of their grant where we were to build that. And in fact, we had gone back to do an amendment with them, and we were just discussing with them, should that remain part of their grant. We weren't going to reduce what their amount was, but we could fund it through other means. And they were like, no, we really want to be a part of that, and we want that part of our project. And I think they knew what they were talking about, because they just the fact that we installed those, it was picked up nationwide, and like the San Francisco Chronicle ran a story on Dubuque, Iowa, and having floating islands. So people are probably wondering, where's Dubuque, Iowa on the
right.
map all of a sudden? So
are floating islands kind of a new technology?
Well, they're yeah, especially in the United States. I mean, there's some people are down like in Florida, they have using them a lot more, where they have more issues with water quality, and so there's really this push to use them to help clean up water, like reduce nutrients, like I mentioned, especially like industrial processes and plants like that. But I mean, just a little bit about it. We planted 14 of them. They total about 2,600 square feet, and just one way to look at it in terms of water quality is the 2,600 square feet we created. There was one study that indicates that would provide the equivalent of 10 acres of created wetland in terms of the water quality benefits. So it just, because you've got the surface improvements and then the plants that grow down into the water below,
right.
just that more surface area. So, and they make them out of recycled plastic bottles. And so, it's like tens of thousands of plastic bottles were used to make these, instead of ending up in some landfill somewhere. So
right.
they're pretty neat, sustainable practice.
Yeah, that is neat. And now, are there any other floating islands in the Midwest area, or was this the first kind of in the kind of Midwest?
I think to this scale, we're probably the first. I know Iowa State had actually done a study on them. And they had planted one and floated one in a pond just to study the benefits of it.
Okay.
But it doesn't. I don't think it's still there. When the study ended. But I think in the Midwest, it's very, very unique.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Neat to be in our community.
Yeah.
So recently the city asked residents on the types of activities and kind of park equipment they'd like to see in a future recreational space down along the lower B branch. Can you tell us where this area is located exactly to give people a good idea of where they might see changes in the future? And then tell us why are we redeveloping that space?
So the space we're talking about is bordered by 15th Street and 16th Street and Elm Street to the west. So, and then to the east, kind of near Sycamore, Cedar Street, Maple Street in that area. It's been operating as a scrap recycling yard for decades. And one of the things that we identified as part of our flood mitigation project is once we have this new creek, we want to make sure it's maintained properly, and to provide a facility to help accomplish that was identified as a need. And so this land primarily was purchased and meant to house some sort of maintenance facility for the B Branch Creek area. Maintenance facility, also parking. One of the things citizens mentioned early on in the process is one of the issues they deal with is a lack of off-street parking. Mm-hmm. So we didn't want to create, this new attraction and not create parking to, make a existing problem even worse. So, that's, kind of the original purpose of this. But again, it's one of those where we're going to have property, public space, and so the idea is are there other uses we can incorporate into this space right next to the creek, as when we redevelop it. Mm-hmm. Right now we're going through the kind of the property cleanup phase where there are some environmental issues with the property. With most properties that are used industrial for decades and decades, there are usually issues environmentally, either in the soil or the groundwater. And what you tend to forget is we haven't had these environmental laws in place they came about, the Clean Water Act was 1972. Mm-hmm. So you have these businesses that predate that by decades and decades. And so, while they did what they thought was right, and they thought they were, acting appropriately, over years, as we learned, we discovered that no, there's some things we probably should do differently, and those things were enacted, but you still have issues with the soil and the groundwater that, mm-hmm. and it's mainly just in the first 12 inches of the soil, just over the years as they're recycling metals or lead batteries, that things would get in the top level of the soil. So we're cleaning that up, and the old buildings typically have asbestos in it, and so there's some cleanup related to that, and so that's kind of what we're doing now. But as part of that process, we have an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency grant that helping us accomplish that. But they like, as do we, to at the same time you're doing this cleanup, to kind of engage the public and on what potential reuses of this property is. So the program that we're operating under is the Brownfield Cleanup Grant, and a brownfield it's an area that was used for industrial purposes or whatever, and now it's become environmentally unusable, if you will, or expensive to use. And so if you don't have a program like this, it could just sit vacant for decades and become an eyesore and an issue for the community. This allows communities to kind of recycle those properties into usable for the community again. So that's the program we're going under.
Very nice. So you talked about the buildings and going through the cleanup process with the Brownfields Cleanup Grant. When might the public start seeing changes down in that area along 16th Street, Elm Street, 15th Street area?
So right now, the buildings on the east side of the property will probably be taken down. Asbestos removal is going to start here in early 2018. And then probably won't see much on the west side of the property in 2018. There'll be some cleanup, but it's going to be primarily related to interior parts of the building, okay. Like I mentioned, asbestos. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a couple of years before we really move into full redevelopment of that property. But we're trying to, our interest is to try to get the site remediated, meaning have the environmental issues dealt with and have it cleared to a certain level prior to that. But it's just a matter of how far we get before we move into that full redevelopment, like in a couple of years.
Okay. All right. Thank you for joining me today, Darren, and providing us with an update on several phases of the B Branch project.
You're welcome.
And so next we will be welcoming John Dietz, who will tell us about upcoming storm sewer capacity improvements in 2018. And until then, we'll take a look back at the B Branch Creek Greenway ribbon cutting back in July of 2017. Well, that was a wonderful event for the city in the summer of 2017. It was great to see such a good turnout. I think we had over 300 people at that ribbon cutting. And so now we welcome John Dietz, who's going to tell us a little bit about the storm sewer capacity improvement projects coming up. So there are two large projects, and why don't you tell us where those projects are located at and what you'll be doing?
So we have some storm sewer projects, and they're storm sewer projects of fairly good size. And they're on 17th Street, going from 17th up to West Locust and down West Locust up to near Kirkwood.
Okay.
And then and it's from Elm all the way up 17th, all the way to Kirkwood. And then 22nd Street from Elm Street up to Central and continuing down up Kaufman all the way to Kane. And those projects are slated to start. Both projects start this summer. They're going to be multi-phase projects because we understand that we need, well, first of all, this is the logistics of being able to construct that much work in a season. We have to phase it. And we also are very mindful of trying to phase it within a phase, so to speak, in order to provide access for the residents and try to maximize people being able to get around. I know people are weary of construction, especially with the B Branch project
Right.
that we did. But these are important projects to help increase the conveyance capacity of the storm sewer system, so that we can essentially reduce those rivers that would come down 17th Street and West Locust and come down 22nd and Kaufman. And there's lots of video out there that people have taken, our amateur photographers showing all of this water that's coming through Dubuque. And part of it is related to just some of the changing climate that we have. Some of it is related just to the topography of Dubuque, because these are essentially two valleys that come through town in the B Branch watershed. And these projects, the intent is to really kind of increase that conveyance. So.
Sure. So you talked about how it's 17th Street and 22nd Street. So which project do you expect to start first?
Well, the 22nd Street project is the one we've started design on first. We actually have done 22nd Street design and 17th Street design for the most part concurrently, but we did get a little earlier start on 22nd.
Okay.
We wanted to get that first phase started, and that first phase is going to go from where we left off on Elm Street as part of the B Branch project and reconstruct just short of Central this year.
Okay.
And it is a large box culvert that's going in the ground. And think of it as there's existing sewer right now. A lot of it's stone, old stone sewer that's running up 22nd Street. We're going to replace them with concrete box culverts that'll be going up the street. And they're roughly 10 by 6 or so in size, 2.5 times the capacity, 2.5 to 3 times the capacity that we have now.
Okay.
So it just kind of gives everybody kind of a little bit of an idea The intent is that if we were to have, let's say, what we would call the prototypical 100-year event, that we would have less than 6 inches of water, potentially, that would be ponded in the street at any particular location.
Okay.
Some areas would be a lot less than that, but the worst area, we would have about 6 inches of water in a 100-year event. A little bit of an education for the viewers that are out there. When we typically are doing storm sewer design and doing street design, the street is part of the storm sewer conveyance.
Right.
So we don't design the storm sewer systems to have every drop of water conveyed in the pipe. They're obviously extreme events where you're having like a 100-year event. You're going to have some water that ponds in the street. And of course, right now what's going on is on 22nd and Coffin, you're having feet of water in the street. And we're trying to get it to a manageable level of around 6 inches at the worst location. Again, a lot of areas that'll be a lot less than that, but it'll be significantly improved over what we have currently.
So it's normal to see stormwater kind of running down the curb line of a street. It's designed that way.
That's correct. Then you're designing, in a lot of cases, you'll design storm sewer for a 10-year event or a 25-year event, and because that is most of your rainfall events, you're going to design to carry that water in the pipe and a little bit of street surface water being conveyed in those rainfall events. But we have obviously seen that we've had that 10-year, 25-year event. It's not a we in the world of civil engineering we call them that, but that's just kind of what we use for recurrence intervals. But as a lot of people would say, it doesn't mean that you're going to get it happening once every 25 years or once every 100 years. It's just that percent chance that rainfall event. So it's a percent. So in the case of Dubuque, we've had how many 500-year events? How many 100-year events? We've had several.
Sure.
And so it's just been the way that the rainfall has worked through this area, and part of our struggles is the topography of Dubuque. We love the topography, we love the hills,
right?
But when you get those flashy, high-intensity storms, they can be problematic.
Yeah.
And so that's what the B Branch project is helping address, and that's what these projects will help do with improving the conveyance.
Yeah, we love the bluffs; they're beautiful, but it causes that water to shed quickly from the bluffs down to the flat areas to the east.
Right, and that's what happens is you get not so much water. You have some surface water coming down the hills, but when it flattens out at the bottom, then you start to have that water pond up, and that's where you notice it. So that's what we're doing right now in these projects. 17th Street project will start shortly thereafter 22nd Street. So the start of 22nd we're looking to start construction in probably around April.
Okay.
And then the 17th Street project would probably maybe start around May, give or take, depending on how things go through the bidding and what have you in plan development. But we're quite a ways away on these first phases. So the first phase for 22nd, again, is going to go from Elm up to short of Central. On 17th Street, it's going to start at Elm Street, get across Central, and be just short of probably, I think, Hebe Street.
Okay.
Is what we're looking to.
So a little bit longer segment.
A little bit longer segment. Part of the reason for that is because of we don't want to have both projects trying to cross Central the same year. So we're trying to stagger it and work our way that way, and trying to facilitate that traffic and not be as disruptive for the traffic.
Right. So construction will be going on both projects at the same time.
That's correct, and it'll be essentially a 3-year project. So you have one phase that like I just mentioned, that's going to be happening in 2018. The next phase for both 17th and 22nd Streets will happen in 2019, and then the third phases or so will be in 2020. We're really anticipating, trying to strive to have both those main corridor projects done by late 2020.
Okay. Multi-year project for both.
That's correct.
So you talked about having a phase kind of inside of a phase to
Right.
accommodate residents as much as possible, give them access to their properties and not close down as many streets at the same time.
Right.
So for the 22nd Street project, which is scheduled to start in about April, you talked about how it'll be from Elm to just kind of short of Central, but you are breaking that down into different segments, correct?
Right. So you have Jackson Street, you have White, you have Washington Streets, and so what we're trying to do is we don't want to go in this block, Jackson or Washington, Jackson, and White all at the same time.
Right.
Because they're major north-south corridors through that area. So we're trying to go through. We'll look into allow traffic on Elm. Well, actually do some work around Elm initially, to do some sanitary tie-ins. But then we're looking to then open Elm up and close down Washington, Jackson, but leave White open. And then we will shift and open up Washington, Jackson, and close White. And that's kind of how we're looking at trying to move our way up the corridor and facilitate that access for all the residents. And it's out of the alleys as well. So.
Yeah. And so this project is increasing the capacity of the storm sewer, putting that new box culvert in like you talked about, but it also includes utility work and total street and sidewalk reconstruction, correct?
That's correct. The project is it's a HUD resiliency project. So we received a significant amount of money from the Housing and Urban Development for resiliency. And resiliency is obviously being more resilient to these stormwater events, but it also means making sure that all of your utilities, everything that you have for infrastructure in that corridor is more resilient. And so in this case, not only are we replacing the box culvert, of course the box culvert is such a size that the street is essentially gone just because of trying to be safe for the workers, be OSHA compliant, what have you. So we have this large opening, and at that point it gives us the opportunity to upgrade our water, upgrade our sanitary, make sure that we've got the proper fiber optic and telecommunications conduit in. We're coordinating with the gas companies, we're coordinating with the power company, we're all working together to address our infrastructure as we work up this corridor. So by the time we're done, in 2020 up through, at least on 22nd and on Kaufman up to Kane, that's all brand new infrastructure. New services tied to the houses, at least to the right-of-way line.
Okay.
And then the property owners can make the determination whether they want to improve on their own beyond that. But we're going to make everything new essentially within that corridor. New sidewalks, new street, new storm. And that's the intent for both those corridors that we're talking.
So speaking of residents and impacts to residents, those who live along the project, the abutting property owners, are they being assessed for this project?
No. They are not being assessed, which is a wonderful thing in John's world, anyway. We are not assessing them. That's essentially the HUD funding is like a community development block grant, CDBG grant, which is really intended to the infrastructure project to bring everything up to current standards and be resilient. And the stipulation is that the property owners are not assessed for that work. So there will not be any assessments on it. The only exception to that would be any private sewer water work that is beyond the limits of our project. If somebody wanted to talk to the contractor or try to work on and coordinate on their own with their own contractor to continue stuff into their houses, that would be on them. It would be a good time to do it just because of the you have a little bit less to deal with as far as excavation and that kind of thing, but good time to coordinate it. But it isn't. That would be a cost to them. Okay.
But otherwise, the improvements, there's no cost for the residents. Great.
Right.
So other impacts to residents, those who live along the corridor, we talked about sidewalk reconstruction. What happens if any of their property is disturbed, as they do construction?
Well, we are going to be essentially touching from right-of-way line to right-of-way line. So the right-of-way line is essentially the property line that you have. It's the separation between private property and public property.
Okay.
For the most part, and I'm thinking it's almost entirely true through this whole corridor. It's behind the sidewalk. So the sidewalk, people may not understand, but the sidewalk is actually public, but through the city ordinance, the property owners are required to maintain it
Okay.
through an ordinance from the city council. But it is still public property. So normally the private property ends on the back side of the sidewalk, or maybe even a few feet in from that, depending on the dimensions of the right of way in that particular corridor or that street. So we are going to essentially replace everything from right of way to right of way. So the sidewalks, the street, the curbs, all of that's going to be redone, including if we have the opportunities, just to let people know, we will be looking at trees. We would like to be able to put trees back if it's possible in some areas, but just some areas it's just awfully tight to be able to do that. It's just not going to necessarily be feasible. But we will be touching those sidewalks, and it may mean that we're going to be looking at courtesy walks that might go up to someone's door, or might be a step or something like that might be impacted.
Sure.
And so we will work with people, and they have an opportunity to really call us if they want, and they have a kind of a one-on-one conversation about impacts to their property. And we'll be doing that throughout the entire project, hopefully working with people one-on-one to just talk to them about how it might impact them. But for the most part, the impacts on private property would be either non-existent or minimal.
Great. So you talked about the segments of construction for the 22nd Street project. For the 17th Street project, where it's a little bit longer of a length, when you're going all the way up through Central toward that Heap Street, how are you breaking that construction down?
On 17th?
Yes.
17th is that first phase again is going to go from Elm to just across Central near Heap. That's kind of the first phase, and we're trying to get, again, because of scheduling and not to be on top of the traffic that would be diverted because of the 22nd Street project. And then from there, we are going to go essentially up to West Locust with the next phase. And then there would be a phase then would go from West Locust, we would basically 17 to West Locust, and we would go up to Kirkwood. And that's roughly the phases that we have there.
Okay.
And then just so people understand, one of the struggles, and we're thinking through this, we understand a lot of the folks have no off-street parking.
Right.
And so we're looking at creative ways to help hopefully get that kind of work around that. It is going to be inconvenient. The projects are not, anytime you're dealing with storm sewer at 100 years old, the whole corridor, the streets have been there forever. You may even have cases where you've got hitching posts that we're dealing with that, we're talking back to the horse and buggy days. So it has been a long time since we've done a major street reconstruction project in this area. And it may be the first time anybody's ever seen one since they were originally constructed. So it is going to be inconvenient. There are some issues with access on the 17th Street corridor and the West Locust corridor. We are going to try to figure out ways to work around it and phasing and work with the contractor. And a lot of that's getting figured out here the next few months as we get farther along.
Right.
We're pretty confident on the first part, which is essentially 17th Street up to beyond Central. There's a lot of access with Jackson and Washington and White. So those aren't so bad. But as you get farther west, it does get more restrictive. And so it'll be a little more of a challenge, but we're up for the challenge. We'll figure it out.
Right. And like you said, you're willing to work one-on-one with residents to talk about impacts to their specific property and how we can accommodate them as best as possible. And if they have any questions about the project, they can call the City of Dubuque Engineering Department, correct?
Right.
So they could call, I know 690-6068 is one of the numbers they can call.
There you go.
And we can help them out.
Yeah.
Okay. So just what you talked about, increasing the capacity of the storm sewers and the utility work and fiber optics, and just making sure all of those components are brought up to date and are more resilient. And one of the things we're trying to do is get stormwater off the street more quickly into the storm sewer system. So are there additional storm drains or different types of storm drains that are being incorporated into this project to help achieve that?
There are. You may see a combination of different intake types. There'll be a longitude or kind of intakes kind of near the 17th and Elm intersection. You may see some that run all the way across the street. So they're like large grate intakes. They're taking water and putting it into the culvert. We'll be adding probably 60 or so intakes above and beyond what are there now on each corridor.
So quite a
so
few
there'll be
more.
Significantly more intakes. You know, the kind of back in the day, in a lot of cases, in a lot of the development, and just because of the way the topography is in Dubuque, a lot of developments would occur, and basically as long as they could just shed the water down the street, it was, well, it's out of our subdivision or it's out of our area, so it'll go somewhere. And so there was kind of a mixed bag of, you know, how intakes were sized, how intakes were spaced around the city. Some areas on the west end, you'll be hard pressed to find an intake. You drive Asbury Road, you'll be maybe surprised that there are hardly any intakes at all on Asbury Road.
Oh, okay.
Because part of it is it's sitting on the ridge, and the water is shedding off and away from it. So that it just is just the way it works, and how it was designed back in the day. But we're being more mindful of icing now, and issues with icing, and you know, with the way some of the snow events and the rain events have occurred. It's important for us to be able to pull that water and get it off. And it also provides with these additional intakes. I know that some areas have issues with perched water tables. They have issues with sump pumps, that kind of thing. It gives us another opportunity to be able to maybe stub a drain tile or a sump pump drain into the intake, versus it being dumped into the curb line, and then creating an icing hazard for us in the roadway. So, a couple of different reasons for it. One, you know, you really wanted to be able to improve the conveyance, get the water off the street. But it's also think about during the wintertime too. We're wanting to get water off so we can minimize icing.
Great. Is there anything else about these projects that you wanted to share today?
They are, so we will be doing some sustainable features, and in cases where we have existing concrete subbase that we may have come across, because there's some areas where there's pavement on top of concrete. We're going to be taking that concrete and crushing it and reusing it. It'll be base stone on these projects.
Great.
There are Purinton pavers, brick streets that are buried under the asphalt in some areas. And those will be picked up, salvaged, and reused. On the areas of 17th Street and 22nd, at least at this point, because this is as far as we've gotten with design, at least east of Central, we will be using some brick accents around our ADA ramps. Okay. Kind of paying respect to what we have in the B branch right now. So we're trying to tie those areas together. And we're being very mindful on these projects and on where we're connected to. We know we're connected to the B branch for the most part. So we're trying to look at, are there things that we have some elements that tie us to those. They're going to be fully ADA compliant, so we're going to make sure we have all access ramps placed at our intersections. We are looking at opportunities for trees if we can. Curb heights, we are mindful of people, you know, right now in the old limestone curbs, they open the door, they hit the limestone.
Oh, sure, on the vehicle.
They can't get out of the car, right? So one of the things we're trying to be mindful of is trying to make sure we have curb heights that aren't terribly high. You can open the door, and then maybe we have either terraced, what we call a parkway, that area between the back of curb and the sidewalk. Either it's got some slope to it, or it's terraced or something, so that we can allow us to be able to open doors, get out of the car, passenger can get out of the car, assuming you park legally, and be able to get up and get out. So those are some of the things that we are looking. So we've talked about some of those different elements and trying to, you know, make it very Dubuque.
Yeah, it sounds like you've thought of almost everything. Well, things that we wouldn't typically think of.
Yeah, that's right. That's the nerd in me, I guess. So.
And you had talked about how you're connected to the B branch, and I guess that's part of the overall kind of flood mitigation project. Is that the 22nd Street Storm Sewer Improvement Project? Going up Kaufman, that storm sewer is connected to the upper portion of the B branch creek, while the 17th Street project that is actually connected to the lower portion of the creek. Correct? That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. So people, when you're down in the B branch Greenway area, and you're looking at, I think you see some of the water that kind of bubbles out at 22nd Street. A lot of that water is coming from some of the subsurface water coming down 22nd.
So it's fed to kind of bubble up and do that. And so
Right.
when we have a major storm event, then that essentially acts as weir, takes that excess water and allows that water to get into the Bee Branch Creek.
Right. I mean, the project has been going on for several years, and there's several more years yet to come, and sometimes it's hard to remember how it's all connected in
Right.
one system, but
Right, and then understand, we've always talked about this is a 12-phase project as far as the overall Bee Branch Creek mitigation project, and so these are just additional phases of that project. So.
all right. Well, thank you, John, for being here today and
bet.
talking with us, and thank you for watching City Channel Dubuque.